All right, ma'am, we are live now. Thank you so much for joining us now. We'll just wait for 5 seconds. All right. All right. Hello and welcome to everybody. Farhan Ali here, and this is the sixth episode of Anveshana session, a series of expert discussion and Q&As on climate change and human rights. Today's session will feature a discussion on economics, emissions, and climate change, as well as their intersection with our esteemed guest, Dr. Saon Ray, visiting professor at Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Dr. Ray is an economist specializing in industry and international trade. Her research interest includes global value chain, free trade agreements, technology transfer, FDI, financial inclusion, and energy and climate change related issues with emphasis on questions of policy relevance. She has co-authored many books, including Low Carbon Pathways for India. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and participating in this event.
Thank you for having me.
Throughout the session, we will discuss how economics is crucial in determining how to fight climate change, as well as what are the effective economic tools for cutting emissions and how climate change is affecting economies, our nations, and people, and more. So, ma'am, I take this opportunity to raise my first question to you. What significant roles does economics play in determining climate change policy?
Right. Thank you. Um, to understand this question, one has to look at what is the problem. How is climate change causing the problem? Some of it you may be already aware of, and most of it is actually created by humans. So the anthropogenic factors. So the things are the it is this way that basically human activities are resulting in emissions, and this is releasing greenhouse gases, and the earth system basically cannot absorb all of this in the current form. So what is happening is that we are seeing the concentration or stock in the atmosphere rising of CO2, and other also greenhouse gas emissions like methane, for example, is a current concern also. This is leading to other problems like global warming and climate change, which is occurring due to this greenhouse gas emissions. And other kinds of problems that are also getting manifested in the form of in several water related forms, for example storms, floods, and or lack of water, drought in certain places, desertification in certain places, sea level rise, and many other such problems. Now, some of these problems are slow in nature. For example, droughts are extremely slow in nature and are more difficult to observe. But then there are things like floods. India, particularly, is a very flood prone country, and we see the effect of floods, in fact, almost in some part or the other part of the country every year. And it's known, floods are very well known in India, and they cause havoc. Now, what role does economics play in all of this? That is the question. Now,
Um,
what one needs to do in order to estimate some of the damage caused by greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other climate change events like rise in temperature or extreme rainfall, which is precipitation or storms, one has to actually look at the social cost of the carbon, and this actually has three parts. In one there is a specific role of economics, and I will come to that. First, actually, one needs to look at the relationship between CO2 emissions and the ambient CO2 concentration. This is usually the work done by scientists. Then the relationship between CO2 and temperature. Again, this is something that scientists do. But the causal effect of the rise in temperature, rising average temperature on measures on economic activity, this is where the role of the economics comes in and economists come in. So the example that I'm using here is actually only talking about heat. In several other cases, I mean, for example, even in, say, the context of floods, you would have similar kind of calculations. So there is one part that is done by economists, but the scientific part obviously will have to be done by scientists.
Yes, ma'am. So as you pointed out, there are there are many factors, right? So CO2 emissions has risen. Like the rate of rising CO2 emission is 2.6% annually since 1990, and scientists have figured it out. And for economics, it is the what are the damages happening and what are the cause and effect of uh, like uh, this whole climate changing effect. So, ma'am, how does these change in climate impact many economies across the countries? Uh, like take an example of India. India, as you said, it is very prone to floods and everything, and it loses a lot of money because of it. And even recently, the Pakistan was underwater. One third of the Pakistan was underwater, and it has lost enormous amount of wealth. So, how can we measure that impact?
Right. So this again is slightly, it's a complex process, because one, you have to first understand which aspect of climate change you are looking at. So because there are so many different aspects and you cannot actually study them all in
Wow.
I mean, you can study it together, but it is much more difficult. So what typically people have done is that either they have looked at temperature rise, which is increase of heat, and this, for example, has many effects on labor productivity and other kinds of things. Or people have looked at the impact of precipitation, which is extreme rainfall, increase in the number of extreme rainfall days, or storm surges, or I mean the tsunamis that you have, all of that. Because one aspect is that because of climate change, there are so many things that are happening, and when you are taking, say, a particular problem, you are trying to understand what is the, maybe the cost or the impact of that on the economy. So just to give an example of heat, for example, because that has in fact been one of the most studied aspects of climate change.
Yes, ma'am.
So there is this paper by Khan et al., which who have used data for 174 countries and for the period 1960 to 2014, and they have found that climate change has had a negative impact on economic growth. And so one of their finding is that if the temperature deviates by zero point zero 0.01 degrees Celsius annually, the long term growth will be lower by zero point 0.05 uh, percentage points per year. This is globally. And it will they found that this affects all countries. It is the increase in temperature on uh, so if the global average is kept to below 2 degrees, which is what above the pre-industrial levels, which was what was agreed in COP 15 in Paris, then this will reduce global income by about 1.07% by 2000 2100. So one has to actually understand what impact we are looking at. So if this is the example from heat, then there are other kinds of examples that people have found, that the production on agricultural production. This is something that concerns India, and this is a study that in fact done on India, that the productivity of wheat will go down significantly. Then there are other kinds of impact that people have looked at, that even livestock production in the context of India again. Money et al. They have found that there will be a negative impact on livestock production because of the rise in temperature. But there are other kinds of studies that which have looked at other sort of impacts. For example, there have been studies which have looked at labor productivity, they have looked at commodity prices, they have looked at the health impact. Health impact, in fact, is a very big impact that is there. And so it could be loss in man days, in terms of loss of productivity. It could be other kinds of because of, say, uh, poor air quality, we see the increase in incident of asthma. And this is what Delhiites particularly know about. But there are other kinds of impacts that people have looked at. For example, there could be increase in conflicts, and many such other impacts. So there are two kinds of costs that typically economists try to calculate from climate change. So one is the short term impact, which is the short term costs, and the other is the long term costs. So if say by 20, what will happen by, say, 2030, or what will happen by 2100, just to give examples of that.
All right, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us such insightful on multi dimensionality of this impact of climate change. So moving forward, so we understood the impacts now. So how can we overcome it? What are the economic tools, policy tools for reducing, like as you pointed out, temperature. So temperature is mostly increased by carbon dioxide and all the emissions, greenhouse gases emission. So how can we overcome that rising temperature by reducing emission through economic policy tools?
Right. So again, here, there are typically three sets of policy tools that countries use. The first is a carbon price, which could take the form of either a tax or subsidy. And I'll come to examples from India in each case, just to give, to elaborate. Or countries often do what are called, they set mandates for renewable energy. And many of the mandates actually take certain forms. So first, to understand that, you need to look at where is actually the emissions coming from. Now again, in the Indian context, particularly, the generation of electricity, that is power generation, actually contributes very significantly to the emissions. And then followed by, industrial fuel consumptions. For example, certain industries emit a lot of emissions in their processes, through the consumption of fuel that they do while you know making something. For example, the two like highly emitting industries are iron and steel and cement. Then transport, for example, road transport contributes a lot to emissions, and this is particularly trucks, not so much other things. And then smaller amounts are contributed also by agriculture and waste disposal, and then land use change. Now, what India has done in terms of carbon pricing and the tax and subsidy that I mentioned just now, India has actually a sort of 4 5 pronged approach. So one is for highly emitting industries. It has what is called perform, achieve, trade, which is the PAT scheme. Then for renewables, it has what is called the renewable energy certificates, RECs. There is a coal cess. Now, one of the things one has to keep in mind in the Indian context is that the 55% of India's emissions in the power sector is actually coming from the use of coal. And coal is a very big culprit in the Indian case. So there's a cess on coal use, and then there are again other kinds of incentives for increasing renewables. For example, there are sectoral incentives like feed-in tariffs and other kinds of things. So the approach that India has taken is that it is trying to ascertain and put uh, reduce the consumption of coal in some sense, and then by the imposition of the cess, and it is, on the other hand, it is trying to increase its use of renewables, solar as well as wind. And India, in fact, recently has announced also to as part of its in the INDC that India had submitted to the COP 15, that is in Paris. It had given its three-pronged approach, that what would it would do as far as 2030 is concerned. But recently in COP 27, it has actually stepped up and given its long-term goals also, and this includes three things. It has said that it would use green hydrogen, it would increase the use of ethanol, and it would also increase nuclear. So in various ways, India is actually trying to control its emissions. And so it is not like one pronged approach, it is in fact a multi pronged approach and looking at the problem from several fronts.
Well, ma'am, thank you so much, ma'am, for such a detailed explanation. And ma'am, it's like as you pointed out, as what India is doing as a country to control its emission. So there's this global consensus with the economists that for reducing the emission, there must be something globally to control carbon emission, and most of them supports carbon border taxation, which is very prominent in West, but in the global South, it's not, because West has already, like, it seems a little unfair to me. Uh, I just wanted, like, it seems a little unfair to me, like a global carbon taxation, which is supported by the West. They're saying that every nation should pay tax on how much carbon they emit. So, isn't it unfair that the West has already emitted so much of carbon, and now the developing countries are like, they are just pressurizing them to make uh, to to make their emission seems like it's affecting the climate change a lot, because it is, of course, right at the present. But what was emitted long before has a lot more contributed to the climate change. So I just wanted to know your thought. Right.
Yeah. So actually, if you look at the apex organization which is dealing with this, the UNFCCC, and enshrined in the principle is what is called the principle of differentiated responsibility. Basically, that developing countries who have not led to the emissions globally. I mean, in terms of per capita emissions, India is actually very low, but if you take total emissions, it is high. uh, most developing countries actually have not contributed to the problem, but unfortunately they are paying, because they are being affected in some sense more by climate change. I mean, you have the small islands which are getting affected by the sea level rise. Many other countries are getting affected either through increase in floods or increase in other problems that they are facing. So the UNFCCC recognizes that the developing countries should not have to pay uh, for the damage caused by the developed countries, but it is easier said than done. And so one of the things that, in fact, COPs in COP 27, it was there was this discussion, in fact, led by India, that there should be a phase down of all fossil fuels and not only coal. About 80 countries did agree, but no consensus was reached. So what happens at COP is that all the participating countries have to agree. It is by consensus, and unless consensus is reached, then the action, nothing. I mean, it doesn't get translated into action. So but so which means that ambition from the Glasgow Pact, which it hasn't increased as far as emissions is concerned, but there have been other significant gains as far as countries are concerned. Particularly, I would point out is that there has been a fund which has been for loss and damage, which has been accepted for the first time, and the principle of loss and damage, in fact, has got it has gone into the discussion also, pretty much for the first time. So still a long way to go as far as emissions is concerned, but at least some progress has been made on some of the very contentious issues. Now, so it is, of course, not fair for developing that the burden should be placed entirely on developing countries, but and neither can they pay for much of the damage that they are that is getting, they are sort of getting impacted by. But the problem is that getting the developed countries to pay also is not going to be easy. I think a first move or first step has been made as far as COP27 is concerned, but much more has to be done in the in next year and thereafter.
Very true, ma'am. The loss and damage fund, which got which got this breakthrough, which got into this breakthrough agreement and this COP27, will possibly assist developing nations with immediate cost and association with climate change disasters. And moving on, as you pointed out, the COP27 and all these consensus thing. So it's very like these international agreements and all these, making them binding is very tough. I remember the Kyoto Protocol, which was kind of binding to all the countries, was became null and void when US dropped down because it was not able to meet their targets, and then later on even Canada dropped down. And these developed nations, when they do not show such irresponsible way of dealing with problem, then how can we expect the developing and the uh, newly aspiring nations? So moving on now, I want to raise a question. I want to ask you one thing. As you have written a book on low carbon pathways for growth in India, I just want you to, if possible, I just want you to, as I just want you to let us know that what are your views on how India can grow without with keeping their emissions low, and what possibilities are there?
Right. So you see, the thing is, one of the ways in which it is often felt that decarbonization means that, or low carbon growth means that countries should not grow. And again, this is something that is really unfair for developing countries because they are yet to grow and, in fact, reach their potential. So the way out is actually to find ways in which to grow, but using greener options. And this is, in fact, the path that most developing countries are going. But there are one or two problems actually that they face, and I'll just talk about that in a moment. Now, what India has been doing, and which we have also documented in this book, Low Carbon Pathways. Uh, so there is no one pathway, for example, for one country. It will be a series of pathways. So, for example, there will be decarbonization by sectors, but you will also try to do, achieve. There are other broader principles that you will follow. Try to achieve energy efficiency. Try to reduce your consumption of fossil fuels. And the problem that India faces is that it is really dependent on coal, and it needs to make that transition, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what India has also been doing, and I wanted to talk about that, is for example, if you look at, so I mentioned a couple of sectors which are really highly emitting. So of course, it's the power sector. And there, what India is trying to do is move away from using coal, um, and increasing rather its renewable and solar and wind, as well as other kinds of um, um, energy sources. um, India, in fact, as part of its nationally determined goals in Paris, had made this point that, in fact, it will have it will. There are these targets that it has set for itself, that 40% of its power generation will be through renewables by 2030. Among the other kinds of pledges that it made as part of INDC. The other sector that is very important as far as emissions is concerned is industry. And there again, so for example, in the steel industry, which is one of the highly emitting sectors, there is what is called the Green Steel Mission. And steel contributes about 7% to greenhouse emission gases. And one of the ways in which the industry is trying to look at is that to come up with processes that use or they emit less CO2. And again, the same for cement. But in some industries it is easier to do that, to decarbonize, while in some industries it is going to be much more hard. So one has to find the industries in which it is easier to decarbonize and adopt those decarbonization methods. The industry is of course very proactive in this respect. The second is that the transport sector. Now, a large part of the emissions is actually coming because of roads and particularly trucks. And one of the ways in which India is trying to sort of decarbonize it is by introduction of electric vehicles, particularly electric vehicle trucks. And this would be a significant improvement in emissions. This is something that is being rolled out and when discussed, and uh, it's quite a, I mean, I think in the next 1 or 2 years we'll see a lot of action happening on this. um, so apart from that, there has also been a mission to decarbonize the Indian railways, which is another important, and in the railways, in fact, has made a commitment, made a commitment to become net zero by 2030. And so the entire railway network is going to become will be electrified. And the consumption of diesel, which was very it was not very high, but it's quite high in the context of railway, that would be eliminated. But the next step, of course, is that the second base kind of effects, that it is not only important to electrify, but if electric power is generated using coal, then you are not actually achieving your decarbonization targets or goals. So the next step actually is for India to decarbonize its power generation, and bring in what is called coal transition. That is going to be slightly much more challenging for various reasons. One is that India is dependent, I mean, it's one of the cheaper sources of energy, and it is something that, though we import it, we are not, there is a lot of domestic availability of coal, and which is why I mean, from energy security point of view, coal is very important in the Indian context. But I think in India has started recognizing that all of these steps are important, and decarbonization of coal will happen. It will take much more longer, and specific plans. I mean, decarbonization of coal, for example, would need that the state governments, particularly the coal producing states, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, uh, they would have to have their plans ready. A lot of livelihood depends on the coal mines. So, but all of that, the process has started. So maybe baby steps yet, but um, so to answer your question, it is again, it's not like there are ways in which a country can grow by decarbonizing, and I think I've given you some of the examples in which India is trying to do that.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for like letting us have this positive and holistic picture of how India can grow with keeping its emissions low and decarbonization. So, ma'am, I think it's already 30 minutes, and now it's time I open the discussion for and welcome the questions of our audience. So, I would like audience to raise their question in the comment section. Yeah, ma'am. So, Sonu Kumar asks, he has a question saying that how is climate change impacting the cost of living and which section of the society is affected the more?
Right. um so the way to look at it is that um one has to look at the both the short term and the long term costs. So and it depends on which aspect of climate change that you are referring to. So if you take the example of, say, heat, and which is again, as I mentioned, that it is one of the most studied impacts, climate change impacts. So heat can actually lower your productivity. It could reduce the number of working days, etc. So the cost of living particularly would depend on the fact that if you say are not being able to produce, or your days are the working days are a number of working days are getting impacted as the heat increases, there will be a definite cost. Now, it is not easy to do this kind of calculation. Some calculations have been done by people, but they would have to. So, one of the calculation is that um, CO2 is costing the economy about US dollar to 210 billion a year. This is for India. This is one estimate. So a lot of assumptions have to be made, and a lot of things have to be kept in mind while making these calculations. And again, as I've mentioned, that it is specific to the kind of climate change that you have. I mean, it could be, you could calculate it as far as heat is concerned, but or you could look at precipitation and look at if there is an increase in, say, number of extreme rainfall days, how does that impact your cost? um, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am. It does very much. And it's like the question also says like which section of the society it affects the most. So I think it's
Right,
the
right. Yeah, so you see, the thing is that one that's a very important question, because on the one hand, you can, yeah, I mean, when some people have looked at cross country kind of effects, they have found that all countries are affected and rich and poor have been affected. But then there have been some studies which have looked at particular districts across 37 countries, and they found that the districts where the heat rose more rapidly than the other districts, the poorer in those districts were affected the more. And so anecdotally, there are many instances. Obviously, the poor are affected in various kind of ways. One is that people who are, say, working outside on either on farms or in, as far as, say, things like even brick factories or other kinds of activities which are exposed to sun. And again, I'm bringing in the example of heat. uh, the increase, every degree increase in temperature will affect them. So it is, obviously, anecdotally, you can make out that, you know mm, the cost is actually borne by such people, the poorer people. But then there are other kinds of impacts. Say, for example, when you take the case of air quality, again, I'll bring the talk about the Delhi example. I think air quality, in fact, affects everybody who's out on the street more than people who are inside. And in some sense, that it is actually then people, again, poorer people, but not necessarily so, because it could be, people going to their schools, offices, etc. So it could be every strata of society. So there is no, unique or, like a simple answer to your question, but I think one has to look at what kind of effect you're talking about, so either heat or whatever it is, and you know um, the channels through which it is impacting either the poor or everybody concerned.
Yes, mom. So, like, it impacts everyone, but in a different capacity.
Right,
So,
in different ways, definitely.
so is the economic weaker section or the social weaker section which affects the most, who cannot avail
Right,
the
right.
available. All right, ma'am. Second, Deepika Koirala raises the second question. It says that what could be the economic cost to recover the damage created by the climate change?
um Now, it's that is really a, a difficult question. But again, I'll go back to, the kinds of, you have to relate it to the damage. So, for
Yes, ma'am.
example, if you talk about, say, decline in agricultural productivity, or it could be, sea level rise or the negative health income. You have to look at each separately, and then you have to basically estimate the cost based on that. Now, one estimate puts it that India actually, because of 1 degree rise in rise in temperature, or due to global warming, India has lost about 3% of GDP. But then there are other estimates that, for example, again, the paper by Khan et al., they have found that climate change has caused India's reduction in GDP to be about 2.6% by 2100, even if the global temperature rise is less than 2 degrees, which is what was agreed in COP15. Then another estimate has put that 1 degree rise in global warming would cost increase in GDP, India to lose about 3% of GDP per year. But this has also looked at other kinds of, things. So it has focused on the channels, and the channels are, one, through loss in agricultural productivity. It is also through the sea level rise, and it is all through the health expenditure that people have to make. All of these things, not only the heat effect. So just broadly, between, say, 2.6% to 3% would be actually the loss that people have found to be, in India's case. 1 degree rise in temperature would lead to a GDP loss of about 2.6% to 3%.
All right, ma'am. That seems very severe, and the losses and damages, as temperature rises, it is indirectly proportional to the growth of GDP. So, what do you say on when we as the sea level is rising, we like we are witnessing like certain of our cities getting sink down. Like Sundarban Delta is sinking. The Mumbai will be sink. The Calcutta, they say they will be, it will be underwater. So how can we measure such damages? Like it's just the refugee crisis which it will cause, and the businesses and the houses, everything. So it seems impossible to measure such damages.
Yes. So it is actually a very complex problem because the sea level, is something that, in fact, India has a couple of cities which are very vulnerable, and every meter of rise of sea water would inundate all of these cities. So yeah, Kolkata would be definitely underwater, but there'd be other cities. There could be other cities as well. um, Now the thing is that, so one is that cities which are already, say, prone to flooding or prone to these kinds of some kind of because of the sea level rise, they have to take some measures. These are, very difficult because on the one hand we have seen that when Hurricane Katrina hit the US, the embankments that were built actually caused more problems than because the water got locked in. And we've seen that in the case of Surat also, when Surat was flooded at one time. So there is no simple solution that you build a wall and that will take care of everything. One has to, of course, identify in cities that are vulnerable. One has to identify low-lying areas and discourage people from making houses, or in those areas. Or in fact, sometimes they may be, if there is flooding, they have to be forced to evacuate, that which happens in many of the Indian cities. But flooding actually happens not only because of sea level rise, it happens because of other reasons as well: excessive rainfall, and the other kinds of problems that we've created for ourselves by building in areas where, in the banks of rivers, and areas which have should be actually left to drain. We have the Bangalore floods, for example, this year, completely apparently man-made because of stormwater drainage, not taking adequate care of stormwater drainage and building on them. These are things that we have to avoid. So again, every city has to identify its vulnerability. It could be flooding, it could be other things as well. There are other problems that cities face, and take actions. And definitely, we now have a vulnerability mapping for the country, and we need to actually, the zoning that we have needs to take into account that this vulnerability mapping, because if we India faces not one but all kinds of climatic effects, and it has to take all of this into account.
Thank you, mom. So climate consciousness and sustainability as a holistic thing can help us a little. So moving on, ma'am, last question to you is that as we have a lot of audience, they are pretty working class, and like they are the middle class people. How can they like contribute to this crisis? Like in their capacity, what can they do to help climate change and to help mediate climate change and everything?
Right. In fact, one of the heartening points this time in COP27 was the participation of younger people, and increasingly we are seeing a lot of young people, students particularly, who are getting involved in the climate change movement. I think what it means is that, of course, and climate change is going to impact them the most, and so it is unfortunate that we have reached a situation where the adults are not doing anything and the children seem to have picked up the cudgels. But basically what it means is that every citizen needs to become much more aware, adopt sustainable lifestyle choices, Reduce use of plastic. This is one important thing that often gets neglected, but our seas are full of plastic that is going in every year, and that's a huge problem. And I think one needs to begin young. In fact, schools, I understand now, have some kind of environmental awareness. Children are, in fact, definitely much more aware. But younger people also need to build that into their consciousness, that we have only one planet and there is no plan B. So we have to make plan A more successful by adopting sustainable lifestyle choices for ourselves.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was really insightful session, and I hope our audience got a lot of things and from it. And thank you so much for this session. And we're closing it now. Thank you so much for watching us. And Vaishnav
Thank you.
comes.